The top 7 teams in the college football playoff rankings stay the same. Ohio State is in danger of missing out on the Big Ten title game, and Notre Dame locks up a spot in the ACC championship game. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
And a personal foul on number 99 of the defense after he tackled the quarterback. He's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, welcome in, everyone. I'm Jay Smith, and yes, this is After Further Review. Thanks so much for tuning in, whether it's the AFR podcast or if you're watching on Facebook. All right, let's dive right into it. There's a lot to talk about. A lot to dive into here. This is a big week of college football. Things are starting to settle in place, right? We're slowly getting closer to that college football playoff selection day where the top 4 teams are finalized. We've had our second week now of rankings released. The updated rankings for the second week were released last night, and some movers, not anything really in the top, especially the top 7 staying the same. But last week, right, the intrigue with these rankings was Clemson and Ohio State, right? And we talked about that a lot. How the Clemson being at 3 as a one-loss team, and Ohio State being at 4 as an undefeated team. How that was, I think, an eyebrow raiser for some people. It didn't necessarily surprise me. I mean, I think Clemson's resume is much more extensive than Ohio State's. Some people say, well, once you put a 1 in that loss column, you've got to move them down. You've got to have all the undefeateds grouped up there at the top. And I just don't think that has been the mindset of the committee. So, there was a big discussion point, obviously, at having a one-loss Clemson team above an undefeated Ohio State last week. But this week, the script has flipped. Not a lot of controversy in the top 7. I mean, most of these, again, all the teams stay where they were. You had Alabama at 1, Notre Dame at 2, Clemson's 3, Ohio State at 4. Your first 2 out are Texas A&M at 5, Florida at 6, and then Cincinnati. Cincinnati sitting down there at 7. Obviously, the biggest movers in this week's rankings are Northwestern, negative movers. Here we go. So the negative movers in this week's ranking are Northwestern. They dropped 6 spots from 8th to 14th. And then you had Oregon, who dropped 8 spots from 15th to 23rd. You did have a couple of teams, though, that did bounce up in the rankings. Oklahoma State, they rose 8 spots to number 15 after their home win against Texas Tech, and Iowa moved up 5 spots to number 19 after their home win against Nebraska. Interesting little note here, looking at the rankings as a whole. BYU rose a spot to number 13 after they did not play last week. The Cougs they're 9-0. They're undefeated. There's only a handful of undefeated teams below BYU. I mean, you have Coastal Carolina at 9-0. They're 18th. They rose up 2 spots. And you have Marshall at 7-0. They stayed where they were at 21st. USC and Washington, 2 Pac-12 teams, are 3-0. But, again, only having played 3 games, it's hard to compare them to, 2 9-0 teams in BYU and Coastal Carolina. Now, does that mean that BYU and Coastal Carolina are going to beat USC and Washington on in a game? Hard to say, but the body of work for those 2 teams, the Cougars and the Chanticleers, is more, again, extensive than the body of work for the Trojans or the Huskies. So, not a lot of controversy in this week's rankings. Things are settling in. And, there weren't really any big surprises. I mean, obviously the gap between the top 3 or 4 teams and the first 2 out, I think, is pretty wide. We saw that, especially with Alabama and Texas A&M in week 2 when Alabama thrashed the Aggies. Florida is sitting down there at 6th. And Florida's an interesting team because the Gators, you may remember earlier this season, lost to A&M on the road by 3, right? It was a 41-38 game. It was a close game, and obviously Alabama destroyed Texas A&M. Now, you can't really use the transitive property, but it's still a common opponent, right? It's a common opponent for Alabama and Florida in Texas A&M. And obviously, as I think most people are predicting at this point, Alabama and Florida are going to face off in the SEC championship game. Like, that's, if it hasn't already been completely locked up, I think it will be after this weekend. But, the Alabama team from earlier this season, where they were, giving up 48 points to Ole Miss, they were playing really slow against Mizzou. They have really hit their stride, especially as of late. Now, there's a I think an underlying thing you need to look at when you look at Alabama. I saw a lot of praise across a few media outlets, kind of starting last week when the college football playoff comes. There's always a lot of fluff pieces that are written, especially when the college football playoff rankings are coming up. And this article really, it went on. It espoused about how Alabama is in historic territory, and they're just so dominant, and it's that. And I'm like, okay, all right. So I clicked the article, and I'm reading through it, and I go, well, this is based off of a S&P an algorithm that measures the the success or whatever, and there were a few hard numbers, but nothing really that stood out to me. And what really I think almost did the piece in, because it was amazing reading it to see that there was a comparison. Like the article made the comparison, and it said, this is the most dominant team in college football since 2018 Alabama. Okay, well, remember what happened to 2018 Alabama when they were 14-0 and they played Clemson in the national championship in the Bay Area? Oh, right, they lost 44-16. So take it with a grain of salt. Again, it's a fluff piece. It's meant to kind of make Alabama look better, I think, than they really are. But back to my point that I'm trying to make with the thing you need to look at when you look at the Crimson Tide, especially in the last few weeks. Yes, they've been dominant. Yes, they've taken care of business against Auburn, against Kentucky, against Mississippi State. But those games have been home games. Okay, Alabama hasn't played on the road since they traveled to Tennessee back on, when was this game? October 24th. It's been a month and a half. It's been a month and a half since the Crimson Tide played a road game. Now, they did have LSU on the schedule, and that was a road game, and it was postponed. But still, you can't ignore the fact that Alabama hasn't left Bryant-Denny since October 24th? Yeah, October 24th to play Tennessee. And Alabama only has 3 road games this season that they've played. They've played at Mizzou, they've played at Ole Miss, and they've played at Tennessee. Now, I watched every second of the Ole Miss game, and I can tell you right now that the Rebels had the Tide on the ropes, and except for a few plays on defense midway through the fourth quarter, when the game really slipped away from Ole Miss, it was a back and forth ball game, and it was tight, and it was competitive. Okay, I know the final score of 63-48 makes it feel like, yeah, Alabama had 63 and then Ole Miss kind of scored in trash time. No, this game was close, and with about, I would say, 7 minutes left in the fourth quarter, Ole Miss made some key mistakes on defense because they have no defense right now, and Alabama pulled away, ended up winning 63-48. However, going back to this road game thing for Alabama, they didn't play very well at Mizzou. They won that 38-19. Obviously, they were slow, a little sluggish. It was their season opener. But you got to wonder, you really do, you have to wonder, what is this Alabama team going to do in a neutral environment, right? When they go to Atlanta and play in an SEC championship game, or they travel and play in a college football playoff game. Now, if there's anybody in the country I trust to have a team ready to play no matter where the game is, It's Nick Saban. It is. I would pick Nick Saban over Ryan Day. I would pick him over Dabo Swinney. I would pick him over Ed Ogeron. I would pick him over, almost any coach in the country. Almost any coach in the country. I think Alabama travels really, really well. That being said, though, we haven't really seen Alabama tested on the road this season. The Mizzou game was not supposed to be close. The Ole Miss game was not supposed to be close. And the Tennessee game was not supposed to be close. So it makes you wonder, okay, Alabama, you're 8-0. You got LSU left on the schedule, the game that was postponed earlier this season. Now, LSU has been a dumpster fire of the highest degree this season. I mean, it's been I've enjoyed watching LSU this season only because of the arrogance of LSU fans last year after winning the national championship and acting like they had just created this dynasty and it was just going to continue forever. And reality set in at the beginning of this season, and the Tiger fans have had to recalibrate their expectations. I think Coach O knew. We didn't hear a lot from Coach O during the offseason. I mean, I know there was a lot of other things going on, but lots of times when you're the defending national champion, and you have some talent coming back, that coach will hype up the program. They're ready to defend their title. You didn't really see that from Coach O. I think that's because he knew everyone's gone. And we're not going to be very good for at least a year. It's going to take a year. And I said this the day after LSU won the national championship. I was like, LSU's going to get through the season. And at the time when there was a full schedule, I said I was expecting them to go, like 7-4-ish. I mean, 7-5, 8-4, somewhere in that range. I was expecting 4 to 5 losses in the regular season. Well, guess what? They're 3-4, and they have Alabama. They lose to Bama, and they're going to finish. 3-5. Now, the Florida game that was postponed earlier this season for LSU is supposed to be played on December 12th. You play that game, you'd imagine Florida wins. LSU could finish 3-6. Alabama and Florida are left the two best teams in the SEC. What have you seen from the Tigers that makes you think that there's a chance they're going to upset either of those teams? They're not. LSU will finish this season 3-6. And that's worse than I predicted. I'm shocked they only got 3 wins. But again, they were a dumpster fire this year. So this goes back to the Alabama discussion, right? What have we seen from Alabama? What will we see from Alabama on the road in the regular season that gives us an idea of how they're going to perform in a neutral environment? And the answer is really nothing. It's really nothing, right? Mizzou, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and LSU. And, again, look at those teams, right? Mizzou is 4-3. They're third in the East. Ole Miss is 4-4. They're in fourth in the West. Tennessee is 2-5, down to fifth in the East. And LSU is 3-4. They're one below Ole Miss at fifth. So Alabama, this again, Alabama has not played a road game in the SEC against a team that's in the top 3 of either division. They're playing cellar dwellers, and it's still not blowouts. The games are not blowouts. Now at home, completely different story. At home, they're thrashing people. They're shutting out Mississippi State, right? They're dismantling teams. But home games only go until the end of the regular season. So I think that the thing that you need to watch if you're an Alabama fan is how is this team going to perform on the road? And normally, in a normal year, Alabama has pretty stiff competition in road games. That has not been the case this year. Has not been the case at all. And so I think that's something you need to think about. And again, that goes back to the whole Alabama's, the most dominant team. They're the best team in the country. Right now, they're playing like they are. Right now, Alabama, I think, is playing like the best team in the country. Earlier this season, Clemson was playing like the best team in the country, right? When Alabama was struggling, especially on defense, they've cleaned some things up. Clemson's had some issues, especially consistent consistency issues. And so, that's something you need to think about when you look at Alabama and you say, oh well, Alabama, they're gonna run away with it, right? It's just like this ESPN fluff piece saying Alabama, they're in historic territory. They're the best team since 2018 Alabama. Well, they lost the national championship 44-16. So ask anybody on the 2018 Alabama team if that was the greatest year for them, and they're going to be like, well, who cares about the stats? We lost the national championship game. So again, we're just poking holes in that argument of stats are not everything. And so again, with these kinds of fluff pieces, they're designed to create this illusion of insurmountable dominance, and that's not the Alabama team that we're looking at. Alabama's really good, and they can beat anybody in the country, but they are not insurmountably dominant. And we haven't seen any. And at home, I think you can make a case. On the road, we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it on the road. So that's that. The jury is still out on that. I am going to have to see Alabama play Florida in the SEC championship game and beat them by at least 3 scores before I say, you know what, it's Alabama's to lose this year. Alabama is the best team in the country, and they should win the national championship. And if they don't, it's because they screwed up, not because another. That's where I'm at. I'm not at the point of just right. A lot of people out there are already saying, oh, Alabama, pencil them in. Alabama versus the field. I'm taking Alabama. That's fine. If you want to jump on the bandwagon, that's fine. But I haven't seen enough yet to do that. And so I think, again, the LSU game will be important, but also that Florida matchup in the SEC championship game is also going to matter. I think it's also going to matter. Overall, though, again, I think having Texas A&M at 5th and Florida at 6th makes sense for now because, again, the head-to-head, right, A&M won that game. If you put Florida above A&M, I think a lot of A&M fans would be like, huh? Like, what? And that's understandable. I think Florida still has a better chance of getting into the playoff than A&M because A&M's in the West with Alabama, and Alabama holds the tiebreaker. So A&M's just kind of they're putting him there to make him feel good is really what it is. And there's no path. There is not a path at all that gives A&M a shot to push out Alabama for a spot or even get in themselves. There's no way that's going to happen. Too many teams that are going to have better resumes, whether it's Ohio State, whether it's Cincinnati, whether it's maybe even Florida or the loser of the ACC championship game, right? If the loser is Notre Dame and Clemson and Notre Dame switch, there might be 2 ACC teams in. Now, if Clemson loses the ACC championship game, they're out. Absolutely. You're not going to put a 2-loss team that didn't win their conference. The Clemson would not make the college football playoff in that situation. But still, I think much less controversy surrounding these rankings this week, but something you need to keep in mind when you look at Alabama, because there's been obviously points in the season where Clemson's looked vulnerable, Notre Dame has looked vulnerable, Ohio State has had moments. Everybody's had moments. And it's like we're trying to pretend like Alabama hasn't also had those moments, which is typical. I'm not surprised by that. Fluff pieces are always going to be out there, but at the end of the day, you have to be realistic, and you have to say, look, Alabama's been great when they play at home. On the road, not very good, not very consistent. They haven't really played anybody good on the road either, so that raises a red flag. Let's reserve judgment until they play in the SEC championship game, and if they beat Florida by 4 touchdowns, Alabama's the team that needs to win the national championship. I'm happy to get on board after I see that game. Okay, let's take a break. We come back. We'll do the second segment of the show. We're going to talk about Ohio State. Another cancellation for the Buckeyes, and now they're in danger of missing the Big Ten title game. We'll discuss that next. Welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I am Jay Smith, and you are listening to After Further Review. All right, let's talk Ohio State. The Buckeyes come in at number 4 right now in the college football playoff rankings. They are 4-0 on the season, and Ohio State has definitely had a really unique year, I think is the best word for it. they've had Maryland and Illinois games canceled. So they're sitting at 4-0. They have 2 games left on the slate. And from what I understand, unless rules have changed, you need to play 6 games to be eligible. And so by that rule, you can't have 3 games canceled, right? Because these teams came in with an 8-game regular season. You cancel 3 games, you're 5-0. You're not going to be eligible. If you don't get to 6-0, you're not going to be eligible. Or you don't play 6 games, rather, you won't be eligible. So Ohio State needs to play at Michigan State, and they need to play Michigan at home. These games are scheduled for December 5th against the Spartans and December 12th against the Wolverines. Look, it would be really disappointing to see Ohio State not eligible for a Big Ten title. I am not a fan of Ohio State's fans. I don't really have anything against the program, and I don't have anything against Ryan Day. I just don't like their fans very much. But I still think Ohio State, the players on that, they deserve a shot. They deserve a shot. And I don't think it's fair that the rules and the incompetence of the Big Ten commissioner should ruin their opportunity to play for a conference champion. This is still a year, okay? This is still a year where eligibility matters and it counts. And these guys are in school and they're trying to graduate or they're trying to do whatever they were trying to do. And this is still a conference championship that at the end of the day is going to go into the record book. Someone's going to get a ring and a trophy. So, people can say whatever they want about, this year it's a huge asterisk and no one's going to ever look back and care. No, that's BS. That is absolute BS. Okay, there will be conference champions this year. There will be a Heisman winner this year. There will be a national champion this year. Okay, it's all going to matter. Okay, and if you don't believe it, you're going to look at those rings. You're going to look at that Heisman trophy that guy's hoisting up, and you're going to be like, oh, yeah, it actually kind of did. Which that kind of should give you an idea on what I think about players opting out. Now, it's a totally personal decision. If you want to opt out, it's totally up to you. I just don't think it's the right decision. However, for Ohio State, again, 4-0, they've had 2 games canceled. I'm not necessarily saying the Big Ten needs to change the rules to allow the Buckeyes in if another game were to be canceled. I think Kurt Herbstreit said recently that Michigan would pull out of the game just so Ohio State would get screwed, which, he later apologized for that. It was just it was a terrible take. I was like, why would they? No. What rivalry exists where you would rather not play? Well, you would rather, you're essentially forfeiting. You can call it what you want, cancellation, but you're forfeiting the game, just like Florida State forfeited the game when they said, 3 hours for the game, we're not going to play against Clemson. That was crap. That was absolute crap. And Dabo was completely right to sound off on that and say, this is crap. This is absolutely ridiculous. Finally, someone said, no, this is crazy. That it took someone with enough balls to say this is crazy. But either way, I don't know of any rivalry out there that exists where you would rather not play your rival than play them. Like that, huh? Clemson, obviously, a lot of ACC teams, not just Clemson, but a lot of ACC teams lost their in-state rival because the SEC refused to schedule non-conference games this year, right? Florida State lost out on playing Florida, although we kind of know how that would go. Georgia Tech lost out on playing Georgia, although that one would be close. And Clemson lost out on playing South Carolina. Of course, that wouldn't be close either. So, hey, maybe it wasn't a bad thing that these games were canceled. But the thing is that you want to play your rival, you want to beat your rival, but you want to play your rival. You don't want to avoid playing them. Even if it messes up their season, you would rather play them and beat them to ruin their season than just say, yeah, no, we're not going to play you. That's just such a lame thing to. I don't know anyone that thinks that, and I hope that's a very minority opinion if it even exists. Either way, that was some of the comments that Herbstreit made, and he obviously apologized for those, which I think was warranted. However, the Buckeyes, even if they don't play in the Big Ten championship, they would still be eligible for the college football playoff. The question is, here's the real question. If Ohio State has another game canceled, let's say Michigan State gets canceled and Ohio State plays Michigan, doesn't really add much to the resume. They finish 5-0. Okay, the Buckeyes are 5. They've played 5 football games. No conference championship. Are they going to get in? They're already at 4, and I feel they're on the precipice. As soon as the rankings came out last Tuesday, the first rankings, it immediately said to me, okay, the committee feels like Ohio State should be in the top 4 right now, but there is a thin margin of error, right? They clearly have Alabama, Notre Dame, and Clemson in that top 3. They're solidified. If you're putting a one-loss team above an undefeated team in your top 4, that means you really are impressed with what they're doing. So those 3 teams for me were locks. Until they lose or something changes, those are locks. I don't see them switching. Now, if Clemson beats Notre Dame in the ACC championship game, Alabama loses to Florida in the SEC championship game, but again, right now, those teams are locked in there. Ohio State was this wild card. They were in 4. You had A&M and Florida behind them. You had Cincinnati down. Like a lot of teams lurking, a lot of teams with more opportunity than Ohio State to make the case, to improve the resume, to change perception. And so I feel like, Ohio State would be in deep trouble if they weren't able to play in a Big Ten championship game. If they get these next 2 games played, Michigan State, Michigan, it will do nothing for their resume, but it will still get them to the 6-0 mark. They'll play in a Big Ten championship game, which I believe would still likely be against, I think it would be against Northwestern. Northwestern lost this past weekend. They're still 5-1. Closest team to them is Iowa at 4-2. And they do hold the tiebreaker. Okay, they hold the tiebreaker. The Wildcats hold the tiebreaker over Iowa as a close 21-20 win on the road back in week 2. So I don't think it's official because there's 2 games left. Well, actually, Northwestern had their Minnesota game canceled. So, good Lord, it's so hard to keep track of all the different postponements and cancellations. But as far as I'm aware, Northwestern is the front runner for the Big Ten West. They have not locked in their spot. However, if Ohio State were to play the Wildcats, I think it's a pretty safe bet that they would beat them. Northwestern was in the top 10 last week, and I wasn't really sure why, but they were. They lost to Michigan State on the road, and so now obviously they're back at 14th. I think it was, and I said this too, it was really more about putting Northwestern in the top 10 so it makes Ohio State's resume look better. I honestly think that's what it's all about. It was going to say, you'd be able to make the case that, oh, well, if Northwestern were to win out right there, I think they were 8th. It was like 8th, I believe, where they were last week. So if they won out, you'd like to think they would probably be around 6th or 7th, maybe even jump Cincy or something. And if, they played a good game against Ohio State, people could say, oh, well, you got to put Ohio State in the top 4. They'd be a top 10 team in their Big Ten championship. That was really what that was all about. Let's be honest. But no, Ohio State should handle Northwestern, and that would put them at 7-0. Then I don't think there's much discussion about does Ohio State deserve a spot in the playoff. I think they would get it. I think they'd still be at 4. Okay, I think even if Clemson and Notre Dame switch games, right? Clemson wins the ACC championship, and you got an undefeated Alabama. You got a one-loss Clemson at 2. You got a one-loss Notre Dame at 3, which I think would set up a rematch in the semifinal. I could see a scenario where Clemson and Notre Dame play each other in the ACC championship and then turn right back around and play each other in the playoff. I could see that happening. But either way, I think Ohio State still sits in there at 4. Now, the reason for that, the reason that I think Clemson and Notre Dame stay at 2 and 3, maybe they swap, but they stay at 2 and 3, is because the committee does not want a national championship where both teams are from the same conference. If you were to put, Alabama at 1, let's say Notre Dame at 2, Ohio State at 3, Clemson at 4, there is a possibility if Clemson beats Alabama and Notre Dame beats Ohio State that you're going to have a Clemson-Notre Dame national championship. And I'm a Clemson alum. I'm a fan of Clemson. I don't want to see an all ACC national championship. That is not interesting to me at all. It is not good for college football. We need to have, especially in this year of COVID, in this year of nobody being willing to play a non-conference game, we need to have some dadgum non-conference games. Otherwise, it does delegitimize the national championship to a degree because it was essentially a conference game. The national championship was a conference game. Like, that doesn't, no, that's not what you want. I don't think that's a likely scenario. Again, I think the committee has shown repeatedly through past rankings, we don't want that. We don't want an all conference national championship game, all one conference. So obviously a lot's in flux, and we just went through a ton of different scenarios. So I apologize if you had to pause and rewind to keep up with all of that. But I think it's safe to say that Ohio State's best bet, their safest path for a college football playoff berth, is get these next two games played, win the Big Ten championship. They're in. Okay, they're in. Ain't no ifs, ands, or buts. If they don't get the 6-game threshold, if they don't play in a Big Ten title, I don't think the committee's putting them in at 4. I think in that situation you would see, again, your Alabama. You're assuming everything else stays chalk as it is. You'd see Alabama at 1, maybe Notre Dame at 2, Clemson at 3, and then Florida, possibly. Maybe Florida, maybe a 2-loss Florida sneaks in if they play Alabama close. Or maybe, I don't think it's likely, but maybe Texas A&M jumps in there. A 1-loss A&M whose only loss is to Alabama. It was a bad loss, but it's Alabama. I mean, that's kind of what we're, that's how we're treating them, at least right now. It's, oh, hail the Alabama. But, I don't think Cincinnati would get in that scenario. But I could see Ohio State, rather, being left out. I think it's a possibility. But, man, you want to talk about an interesting last couple of weeks of college, this is going to be awesome. If you're a college football fan and you like suspense, this is the season for you. Like, this is going to be great. It's going to be great. And I'm excited to see it play out. I think there's still a path for Ohio State to get in, and there's a definite path for them not to get in. I am of the opinion I would rather see Ohio State be able to play and be eligible. I get no satisfaction, not just as a Clemson fan, not just as a college football fan, I would get no satisfaction with Ohio State being ineligible for a Big Ten championship game or the college football playoff because too many of their games got canceled. Now, the blame is really on the Big Ten. The commissioner and the conference did an awful job. Awful job. People should be fired from that conference. Awful job when you compare to the rest of the country. I'm not going to include the Pac-12 because the Pac-12 was never going to make the playoff anyway. It wasn't going to happen. But compared to the ACC, the SEC, even the Big 12, the Big 10 dropped the ball. And it hurts. It's hurting their teams. We're seeing it play out right now. There should even be a discussion about, is Ohio State going to be eligible for the Big Ten title game? Like, the fact that we even have to talk about this proves the Big Ten screwed up. They screwed up. They screwed their teams over. And it's not just going to hurt them this year. It's going to hurt them in years coming with recruiting and the perception of the league and a lot of other things. There's a whole mess of crap here thanks to the Big Ten commissioner. So we'll see. Again, I think, Ohio State right now, they just went out. They're in, but they're right on the edge. I mean, the margin of error for them is literally razor thin. And the frustrating thing about it, if you're a Buckeye fan or if you're a college football fan, is it's out of their control, really. It's out of their control. I mean, Ohio State can do everything they're supposed to do. Nobody can have COVID, all negative tests, and the other team they're playing comes back and says, yeah, we got 13 positives. Can't play. I mean, it's really hard to have your, the mental edge that you need during the season. So hopefully things work out for the Buckeyes. So obviously, it's a developing story. We will come back to it as needed. All right, take one last break. We're going to come back. We're going to wrap up the show, and we're going to just discuss Notre Dame. All right, they locked up a spot in the ACC championship game. That was announced, I believe, yesterday. Interesting little discussion there we'll have, and that is next. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of this episode of After Further Review. Again, I'm Jay Smith, and I appreciate you tuning in, listening to the show, whether it's through the podcast, which is available on iTunes, Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts, or if you're watching the show on Facebook. All right, last segment we want to get to today, and it has to do with the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame. Notre Dame has now locked up a spot in the ACC championship game. It was a bit of a scheduling change announced on Tuesday, so yesterday, that again allowed for this to happen. Another little note here is the ACC changed their testing procedures, so it requires teams to have a PCR test administered on Thursdays so they can receive the results before traveling. I don't think that will have a huge impact on the rest of the season, but it is an update to their testing procedures. So with this scheduling change, Notre Dame and Clemson now have an open date on December 12th, which is a week before the ACC championship game in Charlotte. The Irish had been scheduled to play Wake Forest, and Clemson did not have a game scheduled for that day. Florida State had requested, they wanted Clemson to play them on December 12th after that game was postponed, and Clemson just said, we're not going back to Tallahassee. They just said, we're not going to do it. We're out $350,000 for travel expenses and all this. We're not going to. We had a date. We showed up. You decided, whatever. We're not playing you. So, hey, props to Clemson. They didn't need that game. I mean, I don't see why Clemson should have to go back down there and play. So good on Clemson, and good on Dabo for calling that out. But either way, the ACC has decided that the three teams really in contention right now for the title game, that is Notre Dame, Clemson, and Miami, they're going to be evaluated based on a 9-game schedule. Now, Notre Dame holds all the tiebreakers, right? They hold all the tiebreakers in the ACC, and they're locked in. So it really just comes down to Clemson. If they can beat, I believe, Virginia Tech this weekend, then that will lock up Clemson in the ACC championship game. Now, if Clemson, Notre Dame, or Miami can't play this weekend, the ACC has said that there's an option to reschedule games on December 12th. Obviously, that's, kind of plan B, but, you got to have a plan B with everything going on from week to week. And Notre Dame plays Syracuse on Saturday in a meaningless game. Means absolutely nothing. Irish are going to Charlotte no matter what. They're the number 2 team in the country. Now, I shouldn't say it's entirely meaningless, because if Notre Dame were to lose, obviously a lot would be different with the rankings this coming Tuesday. That's not going to happen. I don't see Notre Dame losing to Syracuse. I think they're safe. So, there is a game this weekend for Notre Dame, but you got to think they're already thinking rematch against Clemson in the ACC championship game. Other than that, though, there hasn't really been anything else announced from the ACC. Again, this is it's a development that I don't think really changes very much. Like, I think at this point, the expectation was that Notre Dame would be in the ACC championship game, especially after beating Clemson. And Clemson, as they showed last Saturday, this past weekend right against Pitt, with Trevor Lawrence finally back after what feels like a month and a half, they're ready to play. They dominated Pitt in all facets of the game, and I think Clemson is going to march through Virginia Tech, and they're going to be very, very motivated. I think you're going to see a Clemson team as motivated to rematch against Notre Dame as we saw with Clemson's teams motivated against, playing against Alabama. Right? The motivation level is the same. Clemson is as motivated to rematch against Notre Dame as they were to rematch against Alabama after losing to them in that first national championship game. Right? The Deshaun Watson era national championship games. Think about the last I mean, you had 2015, right? That thriller that Alabama won. And then you had 2016, which was the last second touchdown with Hunter Renfrow. Clemson won that. 2017 was a bit of a dud for Clemson. They lost that, I want to say 23-6. In the Kelly Bryant year, where we had 12 wins as a first-year starter. Most everybody Clemson quarterback. And then the year after, obviously, was the Trevor Lawrence 44-16 demolishing of Alabama in the national championship game. And then, this past year, Alabama obviously wasn't in the playoff with 2 regular season losses, and Clemson lost to LSU in the national title game. But I think Clemson's really, really, really hungry to play Notre Dame again, and I think they're going to be very motivated. So this ACC scheduling change doesn't really tweak very much. It gives teams that open week right before the title game, which does allow for guys to get healthy, testing to be done, make sure that everybody's quarantined. All of that needs to be checked. All those boxes need to be taken care of so that when that ACC championship game comes, you get your guys on the bus, you get your guys on the plane, you go to Charlotte, you play the game, and there's no issues. There should be no wrinkles because you'll have had a week off to get everybody on the same page. So I think it was a good move for the ACC to do that because they had the flexibility, because they were more proactive. Unlike the Big Ten, you see the difference. You see the difference. You see the difference in the way this has been handled by the different conferences. Okay, and I'm just saying, it's objectively speaking, as a college football fan, look at what the ACC and the SEC even have done and compare it to the Big Ten, and you tell me which one you think has done a better job. I can't find many Big Ten fans, who are happy with how their conference has handled it. I mean, I'm on Twitter. I haven't met any. If you're one out there, I'd love to hear from you because I don't know many people that are fans of teams in the Big Ten. They're like, oh yeah, my conference has done a great job this year. I mean, they have just really knocked it out of the park. Now, ACC and SEC and Big 12, they've done what they can. They've obviously made some good decisions, some bad decisions. But overall, I don't have any major complaints. I think it was done in a logical way. I think good decisions were made overall, and I'm okay with it. Not really the same for the Big Ten. So we will see how this affects them in the following years. But yeah, no, I think again this schedule change isn't a huge factor, and so at this point you would expect to see Clemson and Notre Dame in the ACC championship game in a couple of weeks. All right, briefly, before we wrap up the show, let's check in on the Pick'em League. We got 1 week left, and man, is it a close one at the top of the leaderboard. I'm still up there at 61 points. Aaron Long is a tie with me for first, 61 points. Looking at our top 5, we got Hannah Reagan at 54. Jackson Wright is at 53. And then Razorback 11, who he's been consistent all year. He's at 50 points. So congratulations to those 5 for being above 50 points. And 6th place is pretty close. We got Trey at 47. Your boy T-Dubs, Taylor Wilson at 45. You got Robert at 42, AJ Carp at 37. So it kind of trickles down. And again, some people had really great weeks, and then other people just, it was a rough week for them. So either way, it's been a lot of fun in the Pick'em League. It looks like it's going to come down to the final week between myself and Aaron. So this is the tiebreak week. I'm going to be watching every game close, and it should be an exciting finish. Appreciate everybody participating in that. It's always a ton of fun. That's all the time, though, we got for this edition of After Further Review. Appreciate you tuning in. We'll have a show for you here coming up soon, but until then, stay safe. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.